So we are ready now for our keynote talk today in the afternoon. So of course, such an event like this here is about communicating science. It's about reaching out to people that we know, people we don't know. It's also talking to peers and talking to everybody else. So is there a need for that for all of us? Is it worth the effort? And to answer that question, we invited Maja Horst from Copenhagen University of Copenhagen, I believe it is. Maja is the head of Department of Media, Cognition and Communication at Copenhagen University. She's a professor in science communication and knows what she's talking about. So she'll talk to us about why science communication a crucial part of science. So Maja has a long history in communication, has won several prizes. I will not take you through all that actually, but only say that where I first heard about Maja was in relation to PhD Cup, which is the national championship in Denmark for PhD students in communication. So this is where you're given the opportunity to talk for 3 minutes and convince a panel, possibly including Maja, about the value of your scientific discoveries. So this is an interesting format. We have copied that to some extent in our pitch a little bit later, but Maja has been the chair for this and has been promoting this for several years, I believe. And we're happy to have you here, Maja. So please tell us, why is it important for everybody?
Yes. So thank you so much for the invitation to come and talk about something that is actually, I mean, it's my job, but it's also something that's part of who I am and what I do and what I believe in. And I also think it's an extremely important part of creating a good society for the future. So thank you for letting me take some of your time. I will try to stop so that we can have a little bit of a discussion afterwards also if you have questions. But if you have some things you want to say and didn't get to say, I'm really easy to look up on the internet. So you can always write me an email or something else if you have things, because I want more people discussing this with me. So I'm going to take you through a few pictures that sort of symbolizes some of the things that I think is important about communicating science. And we're starting with Louis Pasteur. This is a famous picture of Pasteur in his laboratory a long time ago, when scientists were supposed to sit like that. So notice that we look at him and he look at his science. If this was today, of course it would be interactive and we could ask him questions, he would turn out and he would start to explain what it is he's doing. But that's what scientists looked like for a long time, and that's also the relationship. For a long, long time, we were supposed to look at them when they did their work, and we weren't supposed to interfere or have any opinions about what they did. They could just get on with it. That is a long time ago, or at least it's not like that anymore. So what's it like today? Let me show you another picture of a more contemporary scientist. It's not quite contemporary picture, but it's someone who is still right now actually known as one of the most powerful people in Danish science. Do you all know who this guy is? Some nodding. I will explain to the rest of you that this is Flemming Besenbacher. He's currently the chairman of the Carlsberg Foundation, or Videnskabernes Selskab. He's also the chairman of Carlsberg, on the board of Carlsberg. He was also part of Innovation Fund and lots of other foundations in Denmark. He's actually giving out lots of money now. But this is from before he became this. This is when he was professor of nanotechnology in Aarhus. And he had the iNano Center. And the whole thing here is taken from one of the first annual reports of the iNano Center. On the front page, they had this nice picture of the leader and then this lovely thing here next to it. Can you guess what that is? Yeah, come on. One of you, give me what is the thing next to him? What does it look like? Funding. Sorry? Funding, exactly. It's the funding to the iNano Center over the years, and of course it shows that they're being increasingly successful because they're getting increasing funding. The reason why I contrast those two pictures, of course, is that in the first we're looking at a scientist doing science, and in the next one we're looking at a scientist basically being an entrepreneur. This could have been a CEO of a startup company showing the annual turnover. It's exactly the same kind of story that's told by this picture. So that's the first answer for why science communication is important today. That's because we are now dependent on these kinds of curves, and they have to go that way, right, Per? They can't go the other way, because then we can't actually do our science. But that's not all. Now you mentioned the PhD cup. This is the picture from this year's winner. And I really want, you can sign up when you've handed in and defended your PhD. And I hope many of you will do that, because we're lacking people from DTU participating in this. And I can tell you that Fatima, who's right there on the left, she was the smallest measurement away from winning. And I can't really explain why she didn't and the other one won. But I mean, it's always hard to choose. But please sign up for this next time. What's important about this is that I want to say how it's not here. It's a good format. I like it. But there's also a lot of, some people say, why does science have to be made up to be X-Factor-like? And the short answer is, it does, because it's part of our culture. It's not just about talking about difficult things in an easy way so that non-experts can understand it. It's much more than that. It's about who we are as a society, and science and technology is a huge part of that. And that's actually not so visible when you look at the normal television program. So here we have a place where science actually get into, be part of popular culture. I'm going to show you another example of this. This is the Alan Turing Memorial in Manchester. Alan Turing wasn't as well known in Manchester 10 years ago as he is now because of the movie, but also because in Manchester they picked up that he was a son of the city. He lived in Wilmslow, which is a part of Manchester. They made this memorial, which is in the central part of Manchester, and the nice thing about it is they made it as this bench, so you can go and sit next to Alan Turing. And he sits there with the apple in his hand, and the story, of course, is that when he was found dead, there was an apple, and he'd taken a bite, and the apple was, I think, radioactive. And some people have conspiracy theories about how he was killed by the state. But what certainly did happen to Alan Turing, of course, was that he was stripped of all his credentials, and he was sort of pushed out of the good company because of his sexuality. So he's been, in Manchester, remade into a son of the city. They have these bees in Manchester everywhere. This is the bee, also with a picture of Alan Turing, and using him as this example of how Manchester is a place that embraces its LGBT community and is proud of its science. When Manchester had the big science policy conference in 2016, that was just after the Nobel Prize for Graphene. So Andre Geim played a huge role, and of course Brian Cox, who some of you might know as well, who's a very well-known TV presenter in Britain, a sort of science star. He's also in Manchester University. So actually Manchester is trying to re-find all these good scientists of the city and using them, not just to talk about science, but to reenact, to tell a whole story about who we are and what we are. I think there's a lot to learn from this, and I think that it's really nice that they made this memorial in this accessible way that we can all go and sit next to Alan Turing. So that's why I talk a lot about culture when I talk about science communication. And I'm not going to give you the long, hairy talk about why it is that science communication is part of culture. I just said a little bit before. But it's just to say that if we want to understand science in society, how science works in society, and the way we talk about it, the stories we tell, we have to look at a lot more than just how we represent it. We also have to look at how people use it. For instance, that they go and sit next to Alan Turing in a bench and maybe tell their kids about who he was and what he did. Or that we have some regulation, we have rules about how we do that. Regulation is law, but it's also norms. So some places, you know, it's not considered a good thing. If you're good at communicating science, it's probably because you're not very good at doing science. Have you heard that before? So that's kind of one of those norms that we have to think about. It's also about identity. It's about who we are as people, as scientists. When we talk about science in public, we tell stories about what it is, what we are, and what it should be. It's also about the identity of citizens, people. There's a term called scientific citizenship. So the idea that science is part of what it is like to be a citizen, that it's part of your citizenly duty to inform yourself about science. And some people do that, and they're the ones that sort of think it's important that you let yourself be informed, and others will say, that's science, that's not really anything for me. I'm sure you've met both places, both types. And finally, what's the production rules that we have about science and science communication as well? If we take science communication, is that something we do as part of science, or is it something we have to do in our spare time outside of our real job? So there's lots and lots of things that we need to talk about if we want to understand this thing, this science communication as a cultural thing. The most important point that I'm saying is that it is. It is part of our culture. It's not just about taking difficult things and making them simple. And let me give you a little bit more of the serious reason why that is so. So it's not new to have skepticism towards technology. That's sort of been vaccines, there's been resistance against vaccines for at least 100 years. So it's not new that people resist these things. But with the whole experience around genetically modified organisms, I think we took this to a new level. And suddenly, lots of people realized that public skepticism could actually hamper the use of technology, that there would be things that we couldn't do because of this public skepticism. Another example is nuclear energy. In Denmark, certainly at least, we don't have that. There is now more and more problems putting up windmills. We have this whole discussion now also about sort of are the computers and the robots coming to take our jobs. That's not actually a new discussion. We also had that in the 70s, but it's been reinforced again. And the basic point is, we can't look at this and just say that's because people don't understand it. They're dumb. They should just listen to the experts. Because what we know from the whole GMO debate is if we start to say like that, then they're just going to be more sure that they're right and that the experts are not talking in their interest. So the only way to do something about this is to get out there, to talk to people, to hear what their concerns are, and to take them seriously. Because, trust me, I'm an expert. That doesn't work. Certainly not in Denmark, but it doesn't work in lots of other places. We have to understand what it is that people don't like about these things. So, for instance, with the whole GMO discussion, it wasn't because people didn't understand. Well, there were some who didn't think that there were genes in non-GMO tomatoes. But that wasn't why they were skeptical. They were skeptical, among other things, because they saw that it was big multinational companies that were sitting on this technology and they were using it to make more money. And they were afraid that all the poor farmers in developing countries would be even poorer with this new technology. Now that's a valid concern. It's not necessarily right, and I'm very sad that GMOs got this reception, and we need to work about that. But it's not a bad concern to be concerned about the sort of welfare of society. Another one was this thing of turning the whole globe into a big laboratory by releasing genetically modified organisms into fields where they could just spread everywhere. It hasn't exactly come in that way when it comes to computer technology, but we've just had a change in all our IT, all our computers at University of Copenhagen. And when I had to explain to staff while they had to have all their computers reinstalled and all the trouble that it comes with that, it struck me how dependent each one of us is on the weakest link. So this thing that it just takes one person to plug in a computer into the network and do something bad, and then all the rest of us gets hit. So that's the same kind of sense that we have to think about these technologies, because it's not just about us and ourselves. They actually have ways of spreading. That's valid concerns that people have, and we need to take them seriously. If we don't necessarily end up with Trump, at least I hope not, but there is something about looking at America right now. What we see when we look there is a country that's been divided into those people who do understand science, who can evaluate it, use it, feel comfortable with it, who basically think that science is making society better. And in a big part of society, they don't value it, they don't understand it, they don't trust it, they don't know how to use it, and they don't think it's relevant. And therefore, they don't trust it. They end up trusting people like him instead. Such a society is not only inefficient and not using knowledge, but it's also unstable. It's not robust. We risk that it becomes more and more unstable, that we have more and more conflicts about these things, and that's incredibly dangerous. And I used to say this 5 years ago, and people were looking at me and thinking, oh yeah, maybe that's right. And now it's like, okay, thank you, Trump, for proving my point. I wish you hadn't. But it's kind of, that's to me really a sort of scary image of where we could go. So just very briefly, we used to think that the whole point of science communication was so that we could take truth from science and give it to society or the public. Now, with all the conflicts and all the controversy, people started thinking, okay, it's not just about that. And then people started saying, actually, isn't that science and technology, isn't it creating more problems than what it's fixing? Isn't it such now, is what people said, that the problem is not that people don't listen to science, but that scientists don't listen to the people. So shouldn't we start to have, rather than having truth go from science to society, shouldn't we have something else go the other way, namely scientists starting to listen to society and make sure that their science is legitimate in the eyes of society? Now, someone like me will say it's not any one of those. I mean, there are parts of what's going on, but actually it's much more important than that. It's about how we have a relationship, even from the beginning. How is science part of society? And I've just already talked a lot about that, so I'm not going to continue that. It's just to say both this, which is not necessarily about controversies and technologies, skepticism, but just about the use of science. Also this, which is about controversies. Both of these mean that we have to think about this. How do we even have a relationship between science and society? And now I'm trying to sort of wrap it up by being a little bit more concrete. What does this mean for you? This is a very good story about a guy called Matt Taylor, who was the scientist in charge of a space mission, landing what's it called? Like a thing that could land on a comet, and he controlled that. And when he was in television celebrating this achievement, he wore this shirt. And I don't know if you probably can't see it, but it has these very scantily clad women. And it didn't take very long, because there was lots of pictures on Twitter saying, oh yes, women are totally welcome in this environment. And it turns out the guy actually got the shirt from a friend of his, a woman who made it for him for his birthday, and he thought he would make her happy. And he got so upset by all this criticism that the next day he gave a very tearful apology about how he didn't mean this, and he loved women and science and lots of things. And I can talk about this story much more, because I think it's so interesting, this thing that we think about how can we have science, what is it that we represent? How much is he, because people were also saying, why wasn't there anyone in the corporate communications department telling him he couldn't wear that shirt? And I'm thinking, I don't want a world where all scientists get dressed by the corporate communications people, not at all. On the other hand, of course, for all of us, the lesson is, well, we have to think about what we do. And even when we don't mean to, we end up representing things that we hadn't necessarily thought about. So when you talk, you're not just talking for yourself, you're also talking for DTU Compute, DTU, or PhD students, or women in science, or young people in science, or even science itself. You're always representing more than just yourself. So this is not to say be careful, but think about it. Think about what it is and how you want to represent where you come from. I'm not going to do much about this. This is Craig Venter. Some of you will know him. The richest, bestest, biggest science entrepreneur in the history of time. I think this picture says most of what it is, that there is this mixture of money and science which we have to deal with much more than we did 20 years ago. And then I also want to say, even with the most colorful stories, even when you think, come on, this is not interesting, this is not relevant for science, this is just, stories about a young female professor having an affair with the rector, how on earth is this relevant for science? But it is, because the people outside, this story represents University of Copenhagen far more than anything else we've done in the last 15 years. And we've got to live with it, learn from it, and maybe think about it. It's not something that goes away, it's something that's there. And people don't necessarily look at that story, and I'm sorry for those of you who don't know this story, because you probably weren't in Denmark when that happened, but the point is just that we all have to think about how it is we are science, because science is much more than the things, the facts we talk about. It's also about who we are, what we are, and how we represent them. And the latest of that is we are close to having our very own science celebrity in Denmark, namely Eske Willerslev, who's now getting a lot of competition from his brother. But Eske is actually beginning to be famous also outside the Danish borders. And again, people say to me, what's that got to do with us? Well, it does, because as soon as we go outside of our own walls, this is how people see scientists. And there's very little, it's a very small step from this guy to Indiana Jones. So next time you go and see movies about your something digital, or something with computers, or something with the future, you see the craziest sci-fi movie. Think about how you can use that also to talk about what it is that you do, where it is that you are, what can science actually do? Because we can't fight this science celebrity and the influence from science fiction. What we can do is we can use it smartly to move on and do something with it. So I'm going to end with a few pieces of good advice, which relates to what I've been saying, some of it. So think about what you want to represent, to whom and why. And you don't have to be corporate. You don't have to have the DTU communication director right behind you, approving what it is you're doing. But think about the fact that you do represent more than just yourself. You have to be able to sell science. It's necessary to attract resources. You have to be able to sell your science and yourself. You have to be someone that people want to invest in, whether that's funding or just getting the right students to come and work on your projects or whatever. But you have to be able to talk to people and generate enthusiasm for what it is you're doing. That's important. But consider the side effects. And one certain thing is, don't exaggerate too much. Think about that people can hear what you're, so they can come back and say, you said you were going to do that, now you did what? And remember that you do always communicate whether you want to or not. If I just stood here saying nothing when I was introduced, that would have been communication as well. You would have interpreted that as a message. I haven't talked about the media, but let me just say, the media is not your enemy. They're not out to get you. And in fact, they're quite subservient to science still, but they are not a servant of science. The media has their own logics, their own things they want to do. They're not there to spread the truth taken directly from the Master Science. So if you want to work with media, understand how it works and use it. And then, this is where I'm going to end. Use all the, I just talked to Kim about that. I mean, you're doing this now. You're practicing talking about your science. And I hope that all of you get to talk to someone who isn't an expert, who's far from an expert in your field. Because that's where you really learn how it is you can talk about what it is that you do. And I would also say, next time you get to some boring old 50-year-old person's birthday party and you get to sit next to Uncle George or whoever it is, and you think, oh my God, how am I going to survive this? Use that. That's the best learning opportunity you have. It's all those places where you think of, how am I going to talk to this person for the next whatever? I have to, I sit here. Use it as an opportunity to practice your skills. And when you use that, start with your own engagement and your own enthusiasm. If you love what you're doing, and then you just need to share that, then everyone is going to be taken in by your enthusiasm, by your engagement. That's what you should share with people. Not the truth, not facts, but why you're doing what it is you're doing. And then you can sneak in the facts, sort of, in the back door. But that's it. Thank you.
So thanks a lot, Maja. So I think it's always safe to wear a white shirt in case you might question that. So there's time for a few questions if anyone dare. So I could maybe start with one question. So for people being pure scientists, reaching out is not so easy when you are sitting at a table. Talking to people, it's you think about, okay, I have 20 seconds, I might as well get it over with, and then we can continue before the person falls asleep. So that's
so first of all, don't think people are going to fall asleep, because you're spending your life doing it. So don't think people are totally different from you. They might need help, but if you start with why it is you're spending your life on it, use that as a resource. If you burn for something, if you have engagement, they will 95% of the time think that's interesting. But I understand that some things are easier to communicate about than others. No one never understands my field of research. They think that I basically study what I'm doing now, sort of, see what techniques work best, which is, I've just been telling you what it is that I'm interested in. So it's not that. But it doesn't matter, because whenever they ask, what's that weird thing you're studying? I use it as a way of talking about things that are important to me, that's to do with my science. Maybe I don't need to tell them exactly what it is that I'm doing. Maybe there's something around it that's important. I don't know. But if you work with algorithms of some sort, don't you think it's important we have better public discussion about what algorithms do? What's this with Facebook and Google, and how is it they're working? And okay, it might be a bit of a stretch, but still, find something that sort of connects, and then sneak in some of what you're doing. So that's a content question, and the form question is about your enthusiasm. So and Andersen always says, well, basically my research is to count corns of dust. That sounds incredibly boring. But if she can do it, most people can do it.
Thanks for a great talk. I find this very inspiring what you say about we communicate and we need to tell people how we contribute, and I think this is fantastic. But sometimes I wonder, how do we strike the balance between that sort of applied science or useful science and basic research, right? How can we also make sure to represent our colleagues who do this very classic science where you really don't know what is it good for, it's just cool, and hey, I don't know, this is the way to find prime numbers, and then 30 years later people use prime numbers for cool stuff. How do we make sure to support this kind of science in this climate of, oh, we always sell our work.
But I think, and that's a really good question. That's something we also have to take care of inside the system of science. So that's something you talk to peer about, if no one else, because we all know that it's not that first we do basic science and then, we do different, and then we apply it more and more, and in the end it becomes a technology. We also know that sometimes, we work on a very practical problem and suddenly something new, basic knowledge comes up, and we try something and it doesn't work. So we need to talk about how all the different aspects of science. And I think in terms of the basic science, it's both, and you gave a good example of prime numbers, how that's important, and who could know that when they started that kind of research? There's lots of other examples of things that we didn't know we would need. So that's one way. Another way is this thing about engagement, because we're all really interested in astronomy and sort of what happens out in the world. And I know that a lot of good things have come out of that as well. But still, on the other hand, counting dust somewhere, and then they say, well, it's about where we come from and the origin of life. So is philosophy and religion, and so there is something about the enthusiasm with which we talk about it, and we have to trust that people will share that. But I also think it's a responsibility within the scientific system that we don't just see those, like Iske, the few stars who then run with all the funding. And there is something wrong with the Danish research funding system right now, because there's too much money that gets given to very few stars. So we need to do something about that as well. That's also in how we talk about it, but it's also in some structural issues that needs to change.
So we do have time for one short question more, if anyone.
And a short answer.
All right, so I think we stop the session here. Thank you.